About 10 years ago, a new neighbor moved into the house across from us in my old neighborhood. She was a woman in her mid-40s who lived alone and rarely interacted with others. If someone greeted her, she would smile and respond politely, but she didn't seem interested in making friends. She often stayed inside her house, and when she did come outside, it was usually for short walks or to get her mail. Although she appeared friendly, there was something a little odd about the way she acted now. Normally I would play with my friends in the front yard, running around and having fun, while she sat on her patio and observed us for hours without hiding it. Sometimes we would glance over and see her just sitting there staring at us with a blank expression. If she wasn't on the patio, she would peek through her curtains trying to see what we were doing, so it felt like she was watching us all the time, even when we were inside our house. Then one night, I was sitting in the den with my parents watching TV and enjoying our time together when suddenly we noticed the lights in front of our house turn on, and we saw a shadow moving in the window. It seemed like someone was outside, but we couldn't see their face clearly. My dad got up to check what was happening. By the time he reached the front door, the person had disappeared. He glanced around but didn't see anything unusual. We talked about it for a moment, but then we brushed it off and decided to go to sleep, thinking it was probably nothing. The next morning, as my dad was leaving for work early, he noticed that our solar panel lights, which were stuck in the lawn next to our driveway, were missing. The ground where they had been was still disturbed with loose soil showing where they had been pulled out. As he backed out of the driveway, he glanced over at our neighbor driveway and saw all 5 of our solar panel lights lined up neatly there, just like we had them in our yard. He was so amused that he called my mom and me, who were still asleep, to come see for ourselves. We rubbed our eyes and walked outside, still half asleep. Sure enough, our solar lights were stuck in the neighbor's yard, but we didn't say anything because we're not the type to confront people, and after all, they were just cheap lights, not worth much. The neighbor was outside acting as normal as ever, watering her flowers. We exchanged awkward glances and decided to just let it go. Every day she would smile, wave, and make small talk with us, as if nothing was wrong. After the incident with the lights, we started to notice other strange things. Our Christmas and Halloween decorations would get damaged or disappear almost every year, which felt odd since no one else on our block had the same problem. For example, one Halloween our carved pumpkins went missing the night before the holiday, so eventually we decided to stop decorating altogether to avoid more issues. We also noticed that our neighbors seemed to copy almost everything we did, from how we arranged our flowers in the garden to the games we played outside. If we bought a garden gnome, she would have one in her yard the next day. If my mom wore a sun hat, she would wear one too. If my parents and I were outside raking leaves, she would come out and do the same. Still, we never confronted her about anything or treated her differently because she didn't seem like a threat. Over the years we lived there, she did many other strange things, but they're not really worth mentioning. We moved away from that neighborhood, and fortunately our current neighbor is kind and respectful. I don't know where to begin with this, but I'll try to explain everything I remember. It happened this morning, so it's still fresh in my mind. I woke up feeling a bit off, and since then I've been searching online for answers all day. I've looked through different websites, tried reading forums, and even watched some videos, but I still haven't found anything helpful. The more I search, the more I feel like I'm losing my mind. The closest thing I found was a post from about 3 years ago, but it had nothing to do with what I'm going through anyway. I've always been a late riser, and with this work from home situation I can choose my own sleep schedule, so I usually stay up late and wake up late. When I finally got up this morning, though it was probably closer to noon, the house felt really quiet and I realized my family wasn't home. I didn't hear any sounds like I normally do, and it felt a bit strange. But I didn't think much of it at first. This isn't unusual, because by the time I wake up my wife and the kids are usually busy with their own things. I'm used to them being out or doing something around the house. But when I went to make a bagel, I noticed the back door was wide open. I thought maybe she had taken the kids outside to play in the yard, so I decided to check. But when I glanced around, no one was there, not in the yard or anywhere nearby. I mumbled to myself about her leaving the door open, since the bugs are pretty bad here, and then I went ahead and closed it right after I turned around. From closing the back door, I noticed that the front door was wide open too. I could see both cars in the driveway through the open door, and it seemed odd to me, so I went to check if my family was outside in the front yard, thinking maybe they were playing or chatting with a neighbor. But when I looked, I didn't see anyone. I began to worry and think the worst. Across the street, I noticed our neighbor's front door was open too. We are really close with our neighbors. The dad is a childhood friend of mine, and our kids have known each other since they were born. I figured my family might be over there, so I walked over and knocked on their front door. Before going in, I called out their names, but when I stepped inside, the house was empty. The living room was quiet and I didn't see or hear anyone. There was not a single sign of them. At this point, I started to feel panicked. All the doors were wide open and my neighbor's house was in the same situation. All their cars were there too. My heart was racing as I walked back across the street to grab my phone, hoping I could call someone for help. That's when I noticed the house next to mine also had its front door wide open. At that moment, I completely lost it. I felt like I was in a horror movie or something. I looked down the street and every single front door I could see was open, but not a single person was around. I hurried back inside and went to my room to get my phone, which was charging from the night before. As soon as I pulled it off the charger and unlocked it, I heard the front door open and my wife and kids' muffled voices. I ran to the kitchen and found my wife holding bags of groceries. I felt relieved to see her, but confused, so I asked her where she and the kids had been and how they went anywhere without using one of the cars. She looked at me like I was silly and said she took her own car and had been gone for about an hour. I explained everything that had happened, the open doors, the quiet houses, and how I thought something was wrong in the neighborhood. But even after all that, she still just looked at me like I was being ridiculous. I felt frustrated because I wanted her to understand how worried I had been. She asked me if I was sure it wasn't a dream. I was completely sure I wasn't dreaming. There was no doubt about it. I could remember every detail clearly. She said she believed me and that we could look into it together. But I could tell she didn't really believe me. I understood why. Who could blame her? I know I sound like a crazy person. Just thinking about everything that happened made my heart race. Later, I talked to my friend across the street. He said he and his family had been home all day, which surprised me. I thought maybe they had seen my family or knew where they were, but when I went to look for my family earlier, there was clearly nobody. This took place a few years ago, but even now I still feel creeped out when I think about that night. At the time I was in my early 20s and I lived in a really rundown apartment complex. The rent was cheap, but the place was known for being a bit dangerous and sketchy. There was this neighbor who always seemed to be listening to James Brown and town music, but he seemed a bit strange. But I thought, how weird could he really be? If he's into some classic old school music, I'd hear him blasting his music at all hours and having loud conversations, often talking to someone or maybe to himself. It was hard to tell. Our studio apartments were right next to each other, so his noise would easily come through the walls. To block it out, I'd play my own music, trying to drown out the sound of his. Then one night he was drinking and had his girlfriend come over to his place. You could hear him being loud and aggressive, but that wasn't unusual for him. It wasn't too late, so I went out with some friends while my boyfriend stayed in. Then around 1 a.m. I got dropped off, and as we drove into the parking lot we saw my neighbor outside. He was standing between some cars in the apartment, looking kind of suspicious. My friends were more freaked out than I was, but I didn't think much of it. I had them drop me off near the entrance because it was easier for them to leave. But as soon as they drove away and I started walking to my apartment, which meant passing by his first, my heart dropped. When I saw him standing there, he was hidden behind the bush that separates our apartments, making him look like that funny Homer Simpson meme. But it was far from funny. He was completely still, almost like he was trying to blend into the darkness, hoping I wouldn't notice him. I waved and said hi because I could see him and wasn't going to act like I didn't. I wanted him to know I saw him and wasn't going to ignore it, especially since no one else was out at that hour on a weekday. After I acknowledged him, he stepped out from behind the bush and into the dim porch light. I've never seen eyes like that before, and my heart is racing just thinking about it. His eyes were wide, dark, and fully dilated like a wild animal's, almost like he was out of his mind. He didn't say anything, just gave me a really creepy look, so I quickly ran into my apartment. My boyfriend was sleepy since it was late, but he mentioned that the neighbor's music had been loud for a while. He also heard a lot of noise and arguing earlier, but didn't think much of it. Later that night we started hearing odd, heavy thumps from the room next door. It sounded like furniture being dragged across the floor. It really creeped me out knowing he was awake and acting so strangely. The next morning I heard the police outside banging on his door. I was partly relieved to see them, but also really scared, wondering why they were there in the first place. They took him away in handcuffs after they forced their way into his apartment. The police asked me when I last talked to or saw him, and I told them about that night, how he was acting weirdly, the arguing, the loud noises, and the thumping sounds all night. The next day I learned something that made my stomach turn and will haunt me forever, but I won't go into the details here. Just thinking about it still makes me shiver. I heard from the groundskeeper, and I'll keep it simple because it was really awful. That neighbor got into a fight with his girlfriend that night and she ended up in the hospital. I felt so sad for this woman who didn't deserve that at all. To this day I feel sick thinking about how close I was to being in real danger. He could have attacked me in his madness since he was hiding in the dark. To everyone who trusts their intuition, take it seriously. If you have a bad feeling about someone, even if they seem harmless, keep your music distance.